Most of us are still reeling from last week's shooting in Uvalde, Texas. While some people put their grief to good use by volunteering, I channeled my rage by flying to Paris and throwing cake at the Mona Lisa. Authorities believe the cake was thrown by a man dressed as an old woman, but it was actually thrown by a woman in her prime, dressed as a man, dressed as an old woman. Still, our rage over what happened last week hasn't dissipated, especially as we've learned more about the tragic failure of Uvalde police to do their jobs.
Tactical teams took more than 45 minutes to enter the classroom.
Uvalde police in the local school district are now refusing to and no longer cooperating with the wider Texas probe.
Just 2 months ago, Uvalde School District hosted an active shooter training for their 6-member police force. A first responder unwilling to place their lives of the innocent above their own safety should consider another career field.
I tried to think of a more suitable career for these people, but all I could come up with was elephant shit collector. Actually, no, those cops don't deserve to be elephant shit collectors. Also, turns out the school officer who law enforcement officials claimed engaged with the gunman wasn't even there.
That officer was not on scene, but had heard the 911 call with a man with a gun, drove immediately to the area, sped to what he thought was the man with a gun, what turned out to be a teacher, and not the suspect. In doing so, he drove right by the suspect, who was hunkered down behind a vehicle where he began shooting at the school.
Jesus Christ! How hard is it to tell the difference between Mr. Bishop and the person who is shooting at people? If you thought the unspeakable horror of last week might have convinced the NRA to cancel its annual circle jerk of a gun convention in fucking Texas, no less, you'd be wrong.
The NRA has condemned the Uvalde shooting, but decided to press ahead with its gathering.
Oh my God, read the room, freaks. To be fair, there were some changes to the NRA's Lemon Party. The Grand Old Night of Freedom concert was canceled after artists like Don McLean and Lee Greenwood took their one and only songs and pulled out. Unfortunately, when it came to the people whose parents we wish had pulled out, there was no such luck.
Moments like this tear apart the very fabric of a community that until Tuesday never thought that a tragedy like this could ever happen in such a quiet South Texas town.
There is no substitute for a strong mom and a great dad.
Wise words, but he didn't have to say that to a group of orphans. Look, if you're a little surprised the NRA is still kicking around, you're not alone. The NRA has been in legal and financial jeopardy for years. But it turns out its gun rights above all rights message has become so ingrained in the Republican Party, the GOP will still hold a gun gala just days after a school shooting. As despicable as we know the NRA to be, it's hard to believe that it wasn't always the legislation-blocking, candidate-buying, primordial ooze it is today.
The NRA started as an actual rifle association, a marksmanship club, all the way back in 1871, when a couple of Northern Army veterans from the Civil War decided that Northern boys ought to learn to shoot as well as their Southern counterparts.
Another reminder that nothing good starts by saying, hey, let's try to be more like the Confederate South. After 4 presidents were shot, people began to talk about maybe putting some restrictions on guns. For example, no longer allowing manufacturers to hand out free guns at all presidential public appearances. Back then, the NRA actually worked with the government to make sure guns were only used for things like hunting, sharpshooting, and making Marty McFly do the moonwalk. You know, when you think about it, Back to the Future is just the story of a white guy who travels through time to steal black people's ideas. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the NRA helped draft state and federal laws enacting measures like waiting periods, concealed carry permits, and banning sales to people convicted or indicted for violent crimes. I mean, sure, there was still violence, but it was largely of the hilarious slapstick variety, which thrived thanks to lobbying by the powerful custard pie and banana peel industries. In the 60s, the assassinations of JFK, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. led to renewed support for gun restrictions. And in 1968, Congress passed the Gun Control Act. The law placed substantial restrictions on the purchase of guns based on mental illness, drug addiction, and age. This kind of legislation would be impossible today. If JFK had been assassinated in 2022, Ted Cruz would have called for the doors to be removed from the Texas School Book Depository. Republicans would have said the only way to stop a bad book depository is another good depository with also a gun. While some NRA members found the 1968 Gun Control Act overly restrictive and the organization lobbied to block it from including a national gun registry, the NRA ultimately backed the law. Even Charlton freaking Heston supported it. But I mean, back then, his motto was, "Please take my gun from my warm, alive hands." But let's be real. The NRA's support for gun control also grew from racism. In the late 1960s, the Black Panthers began defending themselves against police brutality by invoking the Second Amendment and patrolling black neighborhoods while armed. When police would stop a black person, Black Panthers would stand to the side and shout out legal advice. It was mostly related to the situation at hand, but they also had some incredible insights on maritime law. The state of California responded by passing the Mulford Act, which banned the carrying of firearms in public without a license. Essentially, racist white California Republicans were so afraid to let black people carry guns, they were willing to lose their own rights. As then Governor Ronald Reagan put it,
"There is absolutely no reason why out on the street today a civilian should be carrying a loaded weapon."
Reagan's fear of armed black people was then vindicated when he was shot by noted Black Panther John Hinckley. By the 70s, the NRA, much like the Bush of its day, had grown wild and unruly when the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, aka the government's fun police, shot a longtime NRA member suspected of stockpiling illegal weapons. Some NRA members became more militant about gun rights, and the organization formed a lobbying arm led by Texas lawyer Harlan Carter. Carter felt the NRA wasn't political enough and led a dissident group wearing orange hunting caps to overthrow the leadership at the 1977 NRA convention. It was an event known as the Revolt at Cincinnati, and it was revolting. On the other hand, seeing a bunch of losers running around wearing orange is actually what gave the city of Cincinnati the idea to start a football team. Suck it, Bengals. Oh, that's right. I learned about you today. Harlan Carter also helped shape the current NRA.
Harlan Carter's new marching orders, which have been in effect basically ever since, were to oppose all forms of gun control in Washington and in the state capitals, and to aggressively lobby for gun owners' rights.
Changes in campaign financing laws allowed the NRA to begin funneling money directly into the pockets of lawmakers. And the NRA also led a pro-gun PR blitz to rewrite history. By the 1980s, a group of lawyers, many affiliated with the NRA and other gun rights groups, published a flood of studies in legal journals arguing that when the Founding Fathers wrote in the Second Amendment about a well-regulated militia, what they really meant was any stupid with a gun. Look, it's true that the NRA has weakened, but gun rights activists have more of a grip on the GOP than ever. In fact, the decline of the NRA has left an opening for smaller pro-gun groups, many of which hold even more extremist views. These organizations file lawsuits challenging state gun control laws, mobilize members, and unseat politicians who aren't extreme enough for them. In 2018, the group Rocky Mountain Gun Owners campaigned against Cole Wist, a pro-gun Colorado Republican with a refreshing name, because he sponsored a bill to allow guns to be taken away temporarily from people who pose an immediate threat to themselves or others. It was a bare minimum gun safety law, and yet these motherfuckers won. Look, as much as I wish the NRA's influence had diminished along with the NRA itself, it hasn't. A majority of Americans have supported stricter gun laws for decades, and yet we're still here. We're still here begging Congress to do just one thing to protect us. We are still here fighting, despite the fact that the Republican Party's entire identity is a lie about the Second Amendment. We are still here, and they aren't.